thanks for joining us today. I'm Mark, this is Preston, got Melody right here. So thanks for joining us for the Body Smart Book Club, where we share the best of what we've read. First, we want to dive right into one of the athlete stories by, his name is Rod Bien, and he just kind of shared some little nuggets of wisdom on what he experienced in his training and kind of developing that mental toughness, how he kind of learned to make it through. So you want to kind of share your favorite points of that story, Melody?
Yeah, so he starts the story by saying by the time this book was published, he had run about 18 100-mile races, and he's one of the top ultra marathoners in the world. And you know, an ultra run is really, really hard, right?
You would know, you've been training for one.
Yes, yeah. I'm training for my first 100-mile run right now, and it definitely has been hard. But he has this issue where he said he pukes 20 times. At least 20 times
joke.
on every
There's
single.
A lot of times.
That is so many times.
Yeah. That's like once every 5 miles.
Yeah, that's crazy. I know. I mean, for me, if I was puking that much, I would be out.
Yeah.
But he has learned to he just decided that this is just a quirk that I have, and I'm just gonna learn to accept it. And he said sometimes he just like pukes mid-stride, just pukes and keeps running. So,
what a guy.
Anyways, the story basically is just about mental toughness, and he says what makes an athlete a good athlete is how do you handle these little challenges when they arise. What did he do when he figured out he had this quirk where he throws up all the time? He just decided he's going to push through it and keep running. What are you going to do when you get a blister, it starts to hurt, or how are you going to push through those things? And he mentioned 3 things that he focuses on when things get really hard. He said he likes to focus on positive reinforcement, just tell himself happy things. He likes to focus on the short-term goals, and I really like that. I'm sure you guys have experienced times where like, okay, I'm just going to make it to that fire hydrant. I'm just going to make it to this tree. I'm just going to make it to mile 8. And you just push yourself a little bit further every time. Another thing he focuses on is just having a positive attitude, again, telling himself happy things. But he tries to prepare himself for the hard things. And I loved this because at the beginning of my 100-mile training, me and my husband are training for this together. I used to always be like, this is so awesome. I love running. This is going to be so fun. And my husband had to say, hold up. Like, it's awesome you have a good attitude, but you need to like mentally prepare for the times on this race where we're crying, we want to stop, it's 3 a.m., we're tired, right? So it's good to have a good attitude, but also mentally prepare yourself for when things like that come up. And then one more thing he talks about is concentrate on what you can control. So for me, I thought about times where maybe I have a blister on my foot and I'm like, I just want to keep going. I don't want to stop. It's going to slow me down. But something that I can't control is I can stop, take off my shoe, work with the blister, put some tape on it, and keep going. That's going to help me run faster. So
yeah.
When he's going through it, one of the things that really stuck out to me was looking at each of these little things that are hindering us individually. They're all like pretty small things. And I think this is why he relates it back to being, called nickels and dimes, is that, a nickel or a dime by itself isn't worth very much. But when you start to get a lot of them, it starts to accumulate to be something bigger. But I think the key here is, when we start to get all these little things, we get a blister, our knee starts to bother us a little bit, we start throwing up, that we take each of them individually, and don't let them overwhelm us, because when they all add together, that's when we start to, get the thoughts of dropping out or the thoughts of, I can't do this. When in reality, these are all just little small things that are bothering us. And we shouldn't let things like that stop us from achieving our goals.
Definitely. I love how he phrased it. He called it the Rolodex of excuses. And I thought that was great, right? We're just flipping from one to the next. Yeah. But you both pointed out something in there that it was recognizing our limits, but not making excuses to not doing something. And so he always kept his training safe. Kind of the same thing, right? You're like, okay, I have a blister starting. Like, let me do something to work with that. So I'm not ignoring things that could potentially be problematic. He said he's only DNF'd one race, and that was because he felt like it would be like medically dangerous. And so certainly keeping our training within a healthy level and being smart about our choices, but kind of that idea of what can we control, what are things that we can do, and thinking about that instead of what do we lack, what are all the things that I can't do, where am I failing? And so again, I think just like we mentioned, that idea of mental toughness, of we're not ignoring the negatives, but we're putting them in perspective. And we're allowing the positives to outweigh those and to help us keep going and to have energy when any litany of those excuses could kind of drop us out or make us perform less than our best or less than we'd like to. So really, really great story.
Yeah, Rod's a pretty tough guy. I don't know that I'd be able to throw up 20 times in a row and be able to keep going. But it's a great lesson, like we kind of got over with us not taking things out of context and just continuing to do what we do. So.
Yeah. Well, I don't have the coordination to puke mid-stride. Let me just, I do not have that. So
well, he's had a lot of practice.
I feel bad for anyone that was running near me, like, just as much as it. There
you go. That's how he deals with the competition. Yeah. So there you go.
No one
people passing you, just start rallying.
Right?
There you go. But no, it's some really great points from that. So before we go ahead, we just want to kind of briefly recap a little bit of what we talked about last time to set us up for some of the things that we want to talk about today. And we talked a lot about training the aerobic system and the anaerobic system, that we need both of those to really achieve the best performance, the best endurance results. But one of the things that we want to draw attention to is that while adaptations to our body, positive adaptations occur in training both systems, we see the changes occur over different timetables. So with the aerobic training and building that aerobic base, it takes a lot longer, right? Thinking weeks to months of training, but continuing to have returns from that. Versus anaerobic, that can happen, some of the changes can happen within hours, but often days to weeks, people are seeing changes. Which is really cool, right? When we're training, like, it's fun to see those changes and like, oh my gosh, I'm performing better, I'm doing this, like, this is so cool.
Yeah.
But one of the problems that the book pointed out, and one of the problems that we see a lot, is holding and latching on too much to those short-term quick gains, and people kind of ultimately handicapping themselves, short-circuiting their training to get quick results.
Right. Well, when you don't do the research, you just see, oh, I trained this way, I did this high intensity training, and look how much stronger I am. Look how much faster I am. So it just makes sense to keep doing it this way, right? But then what happens is you keep doing it that way and you hit a wall because you're not building that aerobic base. You're not giving yourself that room to progress.
Definitely. And ultimately becomes a law of diminishing returns, right? Like you said, we eventually plateau and often start to slide back because of like you said, we're not hitting that aerobic base. And so that aerobic capacity starts to shrink and shrink and shrink. And we start to build that anaerobic capacity and build it. And one of the difficult things about that is that limitation shows up when people are doing high intensity activities, right? When they're walking, when they're running at a lower moderate pace, right? They're not hitting that lactate threshold where that fatigue sets in, where they're burning. And so I think one of the things that happens, and this is something that the book pointed out, is that people say, okay, I keep hitting this during high intensity, I'm just not doing enough high intensity, or I'm not doing the right type of high intensity training. And so again, that aerobic training gets neglected and more high intensity, and I better do it for longer, or I need to get even more intense, right? Get my heart rate up higher. And really, again, that kind of cuts them off at the knees. And even though like intuition would kind of tell us that, like, oh, the problem is during high intensity, do more high intensity training. The solution really is to slow down, even though it's hard to slow down, but to slow down, focus on building that aerobic base. And then when the time is right, when we put in the effort and allowed those adaptations occur, then building on top of that base with that anaerobic high intensity training.
Yeah. Like you said, it does, mentally, like, kind of the first thought you have is to keep putting more speed work into it. But like, it's a snowball effect. The farther you get down that road, the more you want to put more into it. And it really comes back to, in my mind, the mental roller coaster we go through as runners. That as we're training, you can't get too high on your highs and you can't get too low on your lows, because when you do those first initial few anaerobic workouts and you see a lot of gain from them, if you get too excited about them, if you get too sold on that being your only way of training, then you're going to, like we said, hit those diminished returns. And so never judge your training by one data point. Always have it be over, weeks or months that we're judging how we're training. Because when you're looking at just one, that's when we start to get caught in these landslides of doing the same type of training over and over.
Definitely.
Beautiful. Oh, you put it so well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, and I think just kind of focusing in on that, like only looking at one thing at the expense of others, really brings us well into our next point of talking about Vo2 Max. So we talked about that last time, and how that's kind of like the end all be all for a lot of people, right? I'm sure. What's that been like in the kind of the running world and in high school and in track? Like what? Yeah, how did that play out for people in there?
Vo2 Max is looked at like this holy grail. Like everyone like sees it and they're like, oh man, that guy has a Vo2 Max of X or Y. And most of the times, they're ill-conceived. They're like from their Garmin watch or from something like that. That's not directly measuring actually what their Vo2 Max is. When in reality, your Vo2 Max isn't actually the best indicator of fitness. It's mostly predetermined through genetics, and it really is just telling you really like your potential and like the size of your engine as opposed to actually how fit you are at the moment. Because for the most part, your Vo2 Max doesn't change in trained athletes. It kind of just hovers around the same spot.
Definitely. One analogy that I feel like helped me really understand Vo2 Max in its place, and again, pointing out that it's really a measure of potential, of capacity versus actual fitness, right? There's a lot of things that go into that. And the idea was kind of comparing it to different voltages of batteries, right? So I have an 18-volt battery versus a 40-volt battery. Ultimately, that 40-volt power battery is always going to be able to do more work than that 18-volt battery, right? They just have different capacities. And so we can kind of look at that as Vo2 Max, right? What's your ultimate capacity? How much power can you ultimately put out in a given run, in a given workout, just overall? But that really, when we're looking at those fitness factors, when we're looking at building those aerobic adaptations, the anaerobic adaptations, we're looking at things like movement economy. We're looking at what is nutrition like, what is sleep like, how is stress management. All of those things factor into that kind of all-around term of fitness. And we can think of that kind of like the battery charge, right? So all those things are charging the battery so that it can put out power at its ultimate capacity. So we can see where some of the failures in using Vo2 Max is kind of that end-all be-all, like, oh, I'm so much fitter. In that, again, let's compare that 18-volt battery to that 40-volt battery. The 18-volt battery is someone that is very well endurance adapted. That charge is at 100% versus someone who has that capacity, they have that potential of the 40-volt battery, but they have not developed any of those fitness behaviors. They've not made any of those training adaptations, and their charge is at 2%, right? So that 18-volt battery at 100%, right, is able to deliver power over a longer period of time than that 2% that 40-volt battery has. So even though one has more potential to produce work, to produce power, ultimately that other one is charged more. And so it's going to be able to produce that work over a longer period of time. And so, yeah,
I do too. Yeah. I think it's super cool, and it gives a lot of hope to athletes too.
Yes.
The fact that, just because you aren't given, the top tier of genes to be the best athlete in the world, doesn't mean you're not going to be a great athlete. A lot of it comes down to, what you put into it is what you're going to get out of it.
Yes.
And when it comes down to it, obviously the world's best athletes, they are going to have a mix of both. But don't let, a Vo2 Max score, this number that is almost irrelevant, be something that deters you away from training hard and being the best you can be. Because even if someone has a higher score than you, it doesn't mean that they are going to either win you in the race or have a better experience with sports or athletics than you are.
I love that. And just a little side note, because I am one who, I've talked about this in other episodes, I do get obsessed with numbers.
I do too.
This applies to not only your Vo2 Max number, but any number you look at, your heart rate variability, your resting heart rate. don't let any of those numbers define you. Just keep working hard and you'll get there. So.
Yeah. There's some stuff within Vo2 Max testing though that I think is very pertinent to training.
Yes.
Looking at the data that comes in between, you know, getting your actual score, we have data points. They're called our RER, the resting energy
Respiratory exchange ratio.
Thank you. I was thinking.
Sorry, it's all good. There's so many like acronyms. Right?
There's so many. Yeah. Anyway, but these numbers, what they tell you is how much fat or carbohydrates you're burning at any specific time during that test. And so you can match that up with your heart rate and be able to tell you like, okay, when my heart is beating this hard, this many times per minute, I'm burning approximately this much fat and this much carbohydrates. So you can kind of better understand where you're at as you're training so that you can, you know, get close to that aerobic threshold and be able to work at the proper level of intensity as you're going, and use that in your race as well. Because obviously if you're over that aerobic threshold, you're not going to be able to sustain that for a very long time.
Yeah. And so, no, I love that. And that's where, you know, a lot of times we call it Vo2 Max testing still, right? That's what people understand. I like the term metabolic testing because it goes more into those metabolic processes and that, yeah, like what are the fat, what are the carbohydrate ratios? And because it's so easy to overtrain, it's so easy to get outside of those heart rate ranges initially where we're more efficient and effective at burning fat. The cool thing about training that way is that we don't stay at those low heart rates forever. So one thing that was kind of a general thought in the scientific world as far as fat utilization for a long time was that it was really only available in a large percentage at lower or moderate intensities. But what we found with some more recent studies, and definitely like go check those out there in the book. You can read more into those. But that in well-trained and well-adapted athletes, well-fat adapted athletes, that burning fat occurs at a fairly high percentage, even with increasing intensity up to very high intensities. And so if we test and when we train in a way to utilize our fat stores, right, which are really they're better energy, right? So per gram of fat, there's more energy than what we get from carbohydrate, and they're also cleaner, right? We talked about last time some of the byproducts of carbohydrate metabolism, which include that lactate, which can do some screwy things. But really with fat, right? We're water and CO2. That's what we're breathing out, right? That's the ultimate byproducts of it.
Don't get that lactate buildup when you're burning fat.
Yep. It's a very clean process, and so I love that you hit that point because I think that is really the most valuable thing that we can take from the Vo2 Max style of testing, and really kind of give us some tools to up our game.
Yeah, and like Mark was saying, you know, as long as we keep progressing and building that aerobic threshold, that point in which we're still burning primarily fat, we can get to pretty high intensities at that point and still be in that zone. In the book on page 63, it shows a few different graphs that demonstrate that. It has the graph of an elite cross-country skier, and it shows their scores at which, you know, they're burning fat the most and when they're burning carbohydrates the most, and the points in which that crosses your aerobic threshold once you start burning more carbohydrates than fat. And on there, it shows that they aren't burning more carbohydrates than fat until they're just under 90% of their max heart rate.
Which is
incredible.
That is so cool. Yeah.
Do you want to turn that graph around? Show the
Yeah.
camera?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if people were going to be able to see it. So zoom in on there for you. Yeah, pretty cool stuff.
Well, and I think one of the other cool parts of that graph is not only did it, you know, shift that aerobic threshold over, but it also shifted, like, at any given point in intensity, a higher percentage of fats being burned. So I think it was about, you know, those low intensities, about 70% fat burn and then dropping from there versus almost 100% fat burn at lower intensities in that very elite trained athlete. And so that's really cool. So not only can we burn more fat over a longer period of time, but we can burn fat at higher rates in any given intensity. And that's really cool. I think another point to make is that, like, even very like well-trained, let's call, like, we know like there's the skin and bones runners, right? Just like no body fat.
Yeah.
Even with them, still large intramuscular stores of fat. Ranging from like, I guess at the very like skinniest, right? Just nothing there. Still about 40,000 calories, all the way up to 100,000 plus calories available for us to use versus
and that's
about
versus glycogen, which is 2,000.
about 2,000 calories in very well adapted individuals, and so just a huge store of fat to use compared to carbohydrate, and so just a more efficient system.
Yeah, and so that's why, relating this back to kind of what you've seen in your training probably is that, when you're training and when you're racing, you're replacing your carbohydrates, your glycogen every 45 minutes with your goos and gels and things like that, because it really is such a small reservoir of energy compared to your fat stores that you have to replace it, that often.
Yeah.
What is the name of the athlete who just ran 100 miles without eating anything?
Mike Mcknight. Yeah.
Do you know anything about that? Have you heard about his experience, how that was for him?
Yeah, so he is a very fat adapted athlete. That's how he tailors his diet. He does everything to be pretty low carb, so he's always burning lots of fat. And so his version of proving how efficient that can be was he set out and wanted to run 100 miles without taking in any calories. So he could burn off, all those fat stores, prove that, when you have 100,000 calories of fat stores on your body, that you can really propel yourself for a long time. He completed it. Absolutely incredible.
That's so cool.
I can't imagine, obviously running 100 miles in itself is just incredible.
Yes.
I prefer the shorter and faster stuff, but seeing him be able to do that was just inspiring to me.
And did he say, was it really difficult, or because he was fat adapted, was it okay?
I haven't gotten to talk to him since then, but what I've heard so he's another Solomon athlete as well, and so I was talking to another one of our athletes, and he had done some running with Mike after the attempt, and he had said that he'd recovered well and was doing well. Obviously, he just barely did a 300-mile run, so
oh my gosh,
and that's not too long following him after 100. So obviously his body was able to handle it very well and was able to bounce back and put another incredible feat out there by running 300 miles. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, and one other thing to take into consideration is it's not as black and white as I'm burning carbs right now or I'm burning fat right now. You're always burning carbs and fat at the same time. It's just a matter of how much fat am I burning versus how many carbs I'm burning. And that's why you get awesome athletes like that who just don't eat anything. But even if you are fat adapted doing a long race like that, it still is good to have food. You still need to replenish your glycogen stores.
Yeah, I would obviously that wouldn't be the most efficient way to run a 100-mile race. Right. It's more just kind of proving the fact that we do have a lot of fat stores, and that is a very efficient form of energy if we're fat adapted.
I bet he lost 5 pounds that day.
It'd be interesting to see some of the numbers from that.
Yeah.
One, how many calories he ate after the run.
I'm
sure he had a lot. And then two, just how much weight he lost, stuff like that.
I've just noticed when my husband and I do long runs, I always lose a couple pounds. We definitely eat it back very
Sweat out a lot of water.
Yes.
There's a lot of different factors that go into losing weight during runs.
For sure. But I think just proof of concept, right? What our bodies can do, and our bodies are capable of incredible feats if we do the right training and we treat them well while we're doing that training. I think again that goes into some of those other factors, not just our training, but lifestyle habits, nutrition, all those things as well.
With some of those incredible feats, do we want to transition into Killian
Oh
Jornet's
my gosh, yes,
training?
he is just in here. Oh my gosh, he's amazing. He's amazing.
I was blown away. So obviously he's a great athlete. I wouldn't put anyone above him when I'm talking about mountain athletes, running in the mountains and skiing and things like that. He's just absolutely incredible.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think I realized. Being a lead athlete myself, I knew what it took to be a good athlete, but he's on another level.
He's in outer space. I don't. He's. You can probably run in outer space and be just fine.
Probably.
Can I just read that short paragraph?
No, honestly.
I don't want to do him a disjustice for how much he actually does.
Yeah.
And this is him talking about when he was in school. So he was, I'm assuming, probably a high schooler at the time.
Yeah.
It says, so I was in school then, so I'd train early in the morning or after school. And then in the middle of the day, I'd go to the gym or for a run. I used the weekends for longer training. Sometimes I'd bike to school, my skis in my backpack, and then after school, I'd bike 60 kilometers to the snow, ski for 2 hours, and then bike home. Other days, I'd run to and from school, which is 25 kilometers away, each direction. And many times my coach was upset with me because I was doing too much, even though I tried to convince her that the cycling was just my transportation to the training. I was very focused and obsessed.
Yeah.
Just incredible. Like if you add that up, like if he's running 25 kilometers to school and then 25 kilometers back,
that's so crazy.
let's just put it out. That's
As
8
a
kilometers longer than a
17-year-old.
marathon every single day, going to and from school if he runs. And then with the biking, 25 kilometers to school biking, and then 60 kilometers more, and then skiing for 2 hours, and then 60 kilometers back, and then 25 kilometers back home. Like, I mean, you're doing like a century ride like every single day.
Yeah.
That's
And
just
on top of
insane.
like going to school and, you know, other
Just other activities.
yeah, other stuff. He's a teenager, you know, he's probably has a social life, or maybe, I don't know, if doing that much training, like maybe you
Maybe
just
not.
don't have time. Like, but just incredible. I just can't imagine doing that load of training.
Absolutely.
Especially,
It's
as a teenager, like
Oh,
a teenager
yeah.
has that
that
kind of.
commitment.
Yeah.
Seriously.
That's just insane.
So major shout out to Killian. Like,
Yeah.
wow.
Very impressed.
But what I love, so one of the things that we've loved about this book and that I love about Killian is the humility that he puts in to this book and writing this with the co-authors, and within that personal story. You know, he didn't just put himself like, oh, look how amazing I am. He said, I've been really fortunate, right? These are some of the contributing factors to this. And I've just always been good at recovery. So my body's been able to manage these stresses. You know, he's not constantly pounding himself in. And because he's so elite and so fit and so well adapted, his body can handle those large loads without breaking down. And so I think that's the cool part is like, you know, I can do this, but I've put in so much training over so many years, and I've lived this lifestyle that's made me capable of doing that. And so, one, being realistic about it, but two, in not saying like, oh, I'm Killian and I'm the only one who can be this way. And that like, well, you know, these are the things that I did, this was my lifestyle, and these are the sacrifices that I've made. There's also the training that I put in to be able to accomplish these feats. And doing so in such a way that I think is really encouraging for the rest of us. That like if we put in the proper training, we can get a lot out of the wonderful genetics that we have been given.
It's so true. It's, you know, if someone were to ask me what makes Killian Jornet so good, my answer would be because he loves what he does.
Yeah.
I feel like he's just so passionate about it, and he's not. I mean, he's good because he's put in the time, he's put in the work, but I think it really stems from his love and passion for it, and that just really came out in this story, is how much he loved it.
Yeah. What was you mentioned the beauty.
Yeah, so he said, I take it seriously, but not so seriously that I lose my love of moving fast in the mountains. I loved that.
Yeah.
And then someone else said about him after the story, he conceives of sport as a way to discover the landscape both inside and outside of himself.
Oh,
I just thought
love that.
Chills, right?
Yeah.
So I just love that. I also love the mountains, and that's the kind of running I prefer. And I love it because it's so fun to get up and see cool things, and it's fun following Killian on Instagram.
Yeah.
It's amazing what he sees. I'm like, man, I wish that I could get to those places that he gets to. But then it's a whole nother level when it's discovering the landscape inside of you. And I feel like when it comes to this kind of endurance, it really does take a lot of looking inside of you and deciding, can I do this? How hard am I going to push? What kind of person do I want to become through this? So
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think just kind of that same idea that we mentioned last week, right? Moving from curiosity to try new things, and that developing into belief that I can do these things, and we can.
we can. You can.
So, well, awesome. I guess let's yeah, I mean, I think that's a good overview of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Or the chapter.
On that tender note.
I know, what do you say after that?
Yeah, it's like I don't know what to say to follow up that.
Yeah.
How about we jump
Transition.
to our questions here?
Yeah.
So, Preston, do you want to take it away on the first question here on Vo2 Max?
Yes, so we had someone write in and ask us about Vo2 Max scores, in particular talking about like scores you get off of your Garmin watch, and asking how accurate those are, and in particular he was asking why his was fluctuating so much. And my answer to that would be that on a Garmin watch, Vo2 Max scores are measured indirectly and are based off of a bell curve of different data that they've seen with different athletes with those indirect measurements and what their Vo2 Max would be with that. And so without doing an actual Vo2 Max test where you're actually like measuring how much CO2 you're expelling and how much oxygen you're breathing in, it's all just coming down to being guessing. And then like we kind of talked about previously in the episode, that Vo2 Max scores are not going to be a predictor for your current fitness. And so the fact that it's fluctuating so much, I wouldn't put a lot of stock into it because it really is something that's going to be hovering around the same number, more or less, through all of your training if you're a trained athlete. And so I think the most important thing you can take off of that is really just training consistently, and making sure you're hitting both your anaerobic training and your aerobic training, and getting a polarized amount of training there. So.
Amen.
Awesome.
Does that answer?
Amen,
No, I think that was
Anything else you guys want to add?
No, I think that encapsulates it perfectly. So that was awesome. Okay, next question. Let's see, that is very light handwriting.
Perceived effort.
when running.
Yeah.
What was the question?
So it was talking about being able to know when you're working your anaerobic system and your aerobic system, so you can get that differentiation between the two.
That's right.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so that, I guess that's a nice thing. And it goes back to that, like, we're not relying on any one thing to tell us how we're doing it in a given moment. So one way that we can kind of measure the effort that we're putting in, if we're staying in those aerobic zones, if that's what we're training, and then if we're getting into those anaerobic zones, if that's the type of training that we're being involved in. Heart rate, again, is a great method for that. Becomes even more specific and useful in those actual Vo2 Max tests that are conducted in a clinic, right? Because those are giving you numbers for your body according to your breathing, according to your metabolism. So heart rate is a really nice one to use when running, keeping it below a certain threshold that correlates with those thresholds. And then also using perceived effort as a gauge too, right? Perceived effort becomes a little bit more difficult as you go through the race, right? Just due to fatigue. But I think checking in at the beginning of a run and saying, okay, this is where I'm feeling, on this 0 to 10 scale, and either adding a little bit more speed or dropping back a little bit.
Sure. I think it's important to always watch your heart rate and to just be aware of what is my perceived effort, just so you can use that data later on. It's just good to collect data. So.
Yeah, and just be honest with yourself.
Yeah.
If you feel like you're running at a pace that you can honestly say, like, I don't think I'll be able to sustain this for this amount of time, you're obviously over that threshold, because if you were beneath it, it'd be something that you felt like you could sustain. And by all means, it's not going to feel easy even when you're below it. It's still hard work. You're still running. You're still working out. But you can tell, when you're on this kind of landslide down to where you're going to crash and burn. So once you start to feel that, you're probably over the threshold.
Yeah, for sure.
And one more question that I forgot to write down that we got is, so we've been teaching that it's important to slow down, right? But what about people who are just so busy? These people who have always thought that high intensity is a shortcut to fitness. I only have time to do a 30-minute workout every day. What do you tell those people who don't have time to expand their workout?
Yeah. So, I think so much of that, and not to say people aren't busy, and not to say that people don't have demands on their time, because they do, right? Like we live in a very quote unquote busy world, but we get into situations where we feel like we're time poor. We have, most of us are awake for about 16 hours a day, probably, right? And that's what we're trying to cram everything into. But I think it comes to mindset, right? Is it that, I can do this, I can manage my time, I can find time to do the things that really matter to me, or I'm scarcity. Oh, I don't have enough. And so I think what I would say to that person is that the high intensity can be really nice. It can, it does have a certain effect on fitness, right? It can be really good, but again, it's a law of diminishing returns. And if your goal is to become a well-adapted endurance athlete, then that's not enough. I guess if we're talking about like, I just want to be an awesome sprinter, right? Like, then build that anaerobic system. But if you're talking about becoming a runner and becoming an endurance athlete, then you just have to find time to devote to that. And I think it really boils down to what is important to you. What do you value most? I think when we're able to prioritize and say, these are the things that I want in my life, then eventually those other things fall by the wayside. They become less important to us. And I think that health, again, is one thing that really matters, right? This isn't just about achieving a certain goal in the way that we think about it. This really is about building the healthiest body and building the healthiest lifestyle, building the healthiest mindset, so that not only are we able to get more enjoyment and more beauty out of the world around us, but that we're also able to give that out to other people. And so, I know even for myself, right? There's been times I'm like, I'm so busy, but I've looked at what I'm doing. Okay, well, I just read these new articles for like an hour, and then I sound like such a nerd. Let me read. Or I watch Netflix for of course I want to watch another episode, right? But I don't necessarily like paying attention to those things when I'm thinking about kind of my time debt. But I think just being able to take the time and look at our lives, what are good things that can stay in, and what are some things that we can let fall out that won't diminish what we're experiencing, what we're getting out of our lives.
I think you'd be really surprised too. We give this example of Killian running a marathon to and from school. That working your endurance and your aerobic system doesn't need to be a 3 or 4 hour effort running a marathon. Honestly, when I'm working with athletes, I'd say like anything longer than 30 minutes, you're starting to develop that aerobic system. And so, just setting aside 30 minutes, you deserve 30 minutes to yourself to be able to do something like that.
Yes.
And that's the very definition of endurance, is something that is long and over a sustained period of time. And so it really is going to come down to just putting the time and putting the work in.
I love that. Those are beautiful answers. One more piece of advice that I would give is, and this is for someone who maybe you sit down and you look at your priorities, and maybe running isn't your top priority. Maybe other things are more important, but you still want to be healthy. You still want to be in shape. Incorporate workouts in throughout your day. So just make sure you get up and move at least once an hour. Maybe set a timer and get up and do 10 squats every 30 minutes. Just make sure that you're moving consistently throughout the day. Count getting up and cleaning the house and vacuuming and doing the laundry. Count that as your workout for the day. Yeah. Just try to fit it in throughout the day. You can always make time to get it in there and to move.
Just be active.
Yeah.
When you're doing, multiple bouts of exercise too, kind of a bonus there is that when you are doing those extra, if you work out in the morning and then a little something in the afternoon, you're likely to be more fat adaptive for that second workout. And so you'll see that when people are doing like a Vo2 Max test after they've already worked out for that day, their RER will be a lot closer to being 100% fat burning than it would typically be at the efforts that they're running.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. And it was funny. So even this morning, I think just finding ways to incorporate it, other ways to incorporate it in. We had a meeting this morning, and I went on a run while we were having a meeting. I know Cameron did it the week before. That was my inspiration. But, I know that's not available to everyone, but it was a really fun way for me to get that in and still get some things accomplished.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Cool. Well, we want to thank you guys for all tuning in, and make sure to send us your questions if you have any. We're going to be, do you know the pages for the next one that we're going to be doing by chance off the top of your head?
I don't know them off the top of my head. I will post it.
Yeah, and we're open to any training questions you have, whether it's related to the book or just something you're seeing in your training. We do want to talk about a few sponsors that we have before we tune out.
Shout out to the Ochre to Stansbury Trail Series or the Jimmy Thomas 2-Wheeler Race Series. Shout out to the Facebook page Run for Fun. Shout out to the Utah Running Shop. Shout out to the Wasatch Run Club.
Wasatch Run Club, best running group in Utah. I'm a little biased on that. But we meet every Wednesday night to run together. Check us out on Facebook or at wasatchrunclub.com.
All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, guys, and we'll see you on Monday.
Yeah.
But it really boils down to just teaching people that they can do anything that they set their mind to.